The silver dollar landed on the rough-hewn table with a sharp, ringing crack that silenced the entire saloon, and every pair of eyes in Dusty Creek, Texas, turned to watch what the drifter Cowboy would do next. It was the spring of 1882, and the town of Dusty Creek sat at the edge of the Texas hill country like a man who had wandered too far from home and decided to simply stop walking. It was not much of a town, if a person were being honest about it. There was a general store run by a pinch-faced man named Harold Prout, a livery stable that smelled of old hay and older horses, a sheriff's office that was usually empty because the sheriff, a round fellow named Chester Bowman, preferred the company of a whiskey glass to that of the law, and the Lucky Spur Saloon, which served as the beating heart of whatever community Dusty Creek could claim to have. The man who had dropped the silver dollar was Cole Reardon, and he was not from Dusty Creek. He was not from anywhere in particular, which was the kind of thing people in 1882 Texas either respected or feared, depending on how much trouble had come through their town wearing the face of a wandering man. Cole was 28 years old, tall in the particular way of men who had spent their entire lives outdoors, with shoulders broad from years of roping and riding, and doing the hard physical labor that the cattle trails demanded. His hair was the dark brown of river mud, his eyes a shade of gray that changed depending on the light and his mood, and his jaw carried 3 days of stubble that he had not bothered to attend to because there had been nowhere to attend to it. He wore a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, and his boots were scuffed at the toes from 1,000 miles of walking when his horse needed rest. He had ridden into Dusty Creek that afternoon following a job that had gone sideways up near Abilene. He had been working as a trail hand for a cattle outfit called the Double Bar Ranch, and the foreman had let half the crew go when a deal with a Kansas buyer fell through. Cole had been given his wages in cash, which amounted to $43 and some change, and he had ridden south with no particular destination in mind, which was how he had ended up in Dusty Creek on a Tuesday evening in April, sitting at a corner table of the Lucky Spur with a glass of whiskey in his hand, and the particular kind of exhaustion in his bones that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. The saloon was busy for a Tuesday. There were card games at 2 of the tables, a couple of cowboys at the bar who looked like they had started drinking before the sun had peaked, and a man in the corner playing a fiddle badly enough that the notes seemed to apologize for themselves as they left the instrument. The barkeep was a big man named Lou who had forearms like fence posts and the expression of a man who had seen everything and was no longer surprised by any of it. Cole had been nursing his whiskey and eating the bowl of beans and salt pork that Lou had set in front of him without being asked, which was the kind of thing that happened in saloons in that era when a man looked like he had not eaten properly in days. He was watching the room without looking like he was watching the room, which was a skill he had developed over years of working cattle drives and spending time in towns where strangers were not always welcome. That was when the woman came in. She did not come in the way women usually came into saloons in 1882, which was to say she did not come in through the side door with her eyes down and her shoulders set against whatever comment would inevitably be thrown her way. She came through the front door, the same door the cowboys used, and she walked in the way a person walks when they have somewhere specific to be and no time to waste getting there. She was carrying a tray covered with a cloth, and she moved through the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who had navigated crowded spaces her whole life. She was not a saloon girl. Cole could tell that immediately from the way she was dressed, in a plain cotton dress of deep blue that was clean despite the dust that clung to everything in Dusty Creek, with her dark hair pinned up in a practical way that had nothing to do with decoration and everything to do with keeping it out of her face while she worked. She wore a canvas apron over the dress, and her hands, visible as she gripped the edges of the tray, were the hands of someone who worked hard every day. She set the tray down at the bar and spoke a few words to Lou, who nodded and took the tray. Then she turned to go, And that was when one of the cowboys at the bar, a man with a red beard and the glassy eyes of someone several drinks past good sense, put his hand on her arm. "Hold on a minute, sweetheart," the man said. "You work over at the boarding house, don't you? Maybe you could bring me something up to my room later, something warm." His companion laughed at this, the kind of laugh that made Cole's jaw tighten without him quite meaning it to. The woman removed the man's hand from her arm the way you might remove a piece of string that had gotten tangled on your sleeve. She did it calmly, without drama, and she looked at the red-bearded man with an expression that was neither fear nor anger but something much more controlled than either. "I bring supper to the boarders," she said. "That is all I do, and that is all I will do. Have a good evening." And she walked out. The red-bearded cowboy looked after her with the confused expression of a man who had expected a different outcome, and his companion laughed again, this time at him rather than with him. The room settled back into itself, the fiddle took up its apologetic tune again, and Cole finished his whiskey. But he kept thinking about the way she had removed that hand, the steadiness of it, the dignity of it. He did not sleep particularly well that night in the room he rented at $1 a night from a widow woman named Mrs. Callahan, whose establishment was separate from the boarding house the woman apparently worked at. He lay on a narrow cot and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of Dusty Creek settling into sleep, which mostly consisted of one dog barking at another dog somewhere in the dark, and he thought about moving on in the morning, because that was what he always did. The next morning brought the kind of day that Texas did particularly well in April, blue-skied and bright with a breeze that carried the smell of cedar and wildflowers, and Cole ate breakfast at the small counter in Mrs. Callahan's kitchen, because she included it in the price. He had biscuits and eggs and strong coffee, and he was thinking about whether he should head west toward San Antonio or east toward Houston, when he heard a commotion outside. He stepped out onto the porch and saw that down the street, outside the general store, there was a disagreement happening. Harold Pruitt, the pinch-faced proprietor, was standing in the doorway of his store with his arms crossed, and his mouth going at a rate that suggested he had a great deal to say. The woman from the saloon was standing in front of him with a basket over one arm and her spine very straight, and she was speaking back to him in a voice low enough that Cole could not hear the words from where he stood, but measured enough that he could tell she was not losing her composure despite the clear effort it was requiring. A few townspeople had slowed to observe, the way townspeople always did when there was a dispute to watch, because entertainment in Dusty Creek in 1882 was not exactly abundant. Cole told himself it was not his business. He told himself this twice, which was generally the number of times he needed to tell himself something before he knew he was not going to listen to himself. He walked down the street. As he got closer, he could hear what Pruitt was saying, which was that he was not extending any more credit, and that the previous bill needed to be settled before any further goods would be forthcoming, and that he did not care what the circumstances were because business was business and sentiment was for people who could afford it. The woman was explaining, quietly and with precision, that the bill would be settled by the end of the week because she had wages coming, and that she only needed a small amount of flour and coffee, and she would pay for those items now, in cash, and the rest of the bill could wait until Friday. Pruitt was saying that Friday was not today, and credit was credit, and he had extended too much of it to people who thought promises were the same as payment. Cole reached into his vest pocket and pulled out 2 coins without particularly thinking about whether this was a good idea or not. He set them on the edge of the barrel that stood by the store entrance and said, "What does she owe?" Both Pruitt and the woman turned to look at him. $3.40 on account, Pruitt said, because he was that kind of man who would answer a question about money before he thought about whether he should. Cole counted out the coins on the barrel top. "There is $3.50. Give her whatever she needs and keep the change for your trouble." Pruitt looked at the coins with the careful attention of a man assessing whether they were real, and apparently they were, because he stood aside and gestured for the woman to come in. The woman did not move immediately. She was looking at Cole with an expression he could not quite read, something between surprise and assessment, and he noticed now, in the morning light, that her eyes were a dark shade of brown that was almost amber at the edges, and that she was perhaps 24 or 25 years old, with a face that was not conventionally pretty in the way that saloon posters showed women to be pretty, but was instead the kind of face that became more interesting the longer you looked at it. "I did not ask for your help," she said. "No," Cole agreed, "you did not. I was managing the situation." "You were," he said. "I believe you would have managed it fine. Then why did you interfere?" He thought about this for a moment because he had asked himself the same question on the walk down the street and had not arrived at a fully satisfying answer. "Seemed like the faster resolution," he said. She looked at him for another moment, then she nodded once, a small precise nod, and went into the store. Cole put his hat back on and went back up the street, because he had done a thing and now the thing was done and he saw no reason to make more of it. He was saddling his horse at the livery, preparing to point himself in whatever direction felt right, when she appeared at the livery entrance. She was holding the basket in one hand and in the other she was holding coins, the exact coins he had left on the barrel top. "I cannot accept your money," she said. She held it out toward him with the same directness she had used on everything else. Cole looked at the coins. He looked at her. "It is $3.50, he said. "Not a fortune." "The amount is not the point," she said. "I have been managing my own accounts since I was 16 years old and I have always settled them. I will settle this one too. I appreciate that you meant well, but I cannot be in debt to a stranger." "Consider it a gift then," he said. "I do not accept gifts from men I do not know," she said. "That leads to a kind of debt that is worse than financial." Cole stopped what he was doing with the saddle and turned to fully look at her. That was a remarkably perceptive observation. It was the kind of observation that most women in 1882 Texas would not have been able to articulate so clearly even if they felt it, because the social structure of the time did not generally reward women for articulating things clearly. "Fair enough," he said, and he held out his hand for the coins. She put them in his palm and her fingers were brief and businesslike about it, but he noticed that her hand was warm. "My name is Nora Ellis," she said. "I work at the Hargrove boarding house. I cook and clean for 7 boarders and Mrs. Hargrove, and I also take in mending from several of the ranch families in the county. My wages come on Fridays. I would have had that bill settled by Friday afternoon." "I believe you," Cole said. "You do not need to believe me," she said. "I am simply telling you the facts because you appeared to make a judgment on my behalf, and the facts are relevant to whether that judgment was warranted." He put the coins back in his vest pocket. "Cole Reardon," he said. "I am just passing through." "I know," she said. "I asked Lou about you this morning." Something about that surprised him enough to show on his face. "It is a small town," she said without apology. "When a stranger pays someone else's debt, people talk. I prefer to know who I am talking to." She turned and walked back up the street toward the boarding house, and Cole stood in the livery with his hand still resting on his saddle and a feeling in his chest that was unfamiliar enough to be notable. He did not leave Dusty Creek that day. He told himself it was because his horse, a good sorrel gelding he called Red, had developed a slight tenderness in his left front shoe and needed a day's rest. The farrier, when he checked, confirmed that the shoe was fine and the horse was fine and Cole was free to go whenever he liked. Cole thanked him and went back to his room at Mrs. Callahan's and paid for another night. He saw Nora Ellis again at supper that evening. The Lucky Spur served food in the evenings, simple food of the frontier kind, and Cole was eating his when Nora came through with another tray. She was delivering the evening meal to whatever boarder at the Hargrove house could not or did not come down to the communal table, he surmised, because she carried the tray with the focused efficiency of someone on a task rather than someone in a social setting. She glanced at him as she passed his table. It was the briefest of glances, the kind that could have meant nothing at all, but he found himself noticing it anyway. On her way back out, when the tray was empty, she slowed near his table. He had not expected her to stop, and he was not sure she had planned to, but she did. "How long are you staying?" she asked. "Have not decided," he said honestly. "You said you were just passing through." "I did," he agreed. "My plans have a way of being flexible." She considered this. "Where were you coming from?" "Abilene cattle work." "And where are you going?" "Somewhere that needs a capable hand," he said. "I have not found it yet." She nodded at this. It was the kind of answer that made sense in 1882 on the Texas frontier, where a man with cattle skills could go anywhere and usually find work, where the great ranching enterprises that were reshaping the land were always hungry for experienced hands. "There is a ranch called the Colton spread about 7 miles east of here," she said. "James Colton has been looking for a reliable hand for 2 months. His previous foreman left in February." Cole had not expected that either. "You are giving me job advice," he said. "I am providing information," she said. "You can do what you like with it." She walked out, and Cole sat there for a moment with his fork halfway to his mouth and the unfamiliar feeling in his chest, a little stronger than it had been before. The next morning he rode out to the Colton spread. James Colton was a man in his mid-50s, with a weathered face and the straightforward manner of someone who had been making hard decisions for so long that the making of them had become second nature. He had about 400 head of cattle on land that stretched across a valley of good grass, and he was short-handed in a way that was becoming a problem. As spring turned towards summer, and the work of branding and moving cattle to better pasture demanded more pairs of hands than he had. Cole spent an hour talking with him and came away with a job at $30 a month plus meals and a bunk in the ranch hands' quarters, which was a good wage for 1882 Texas, and which solved the immediate problem of where he was going and what he would do when he got there. He moved his things out of Mrs. Callahan's the next morning and rode out to the Colton spread to start work, and he told himself that the decision had nothing to do with the fact that Nora Ellis had been the one to point him toward it. He told himself this several times over the next 2 weeks, which were busy weeks full of the hard physical work of spring ranch operations, branding cattle and checking fences, and helping with the rotation of the grazing herds across Colton's land. The work was familiar and satisfying in the way that physical labor can be when you are good at it, when your body knows what to do before your mind has finished formulating the instruction. He rode into Dusty Creek on Saturdays, which was when most of the ranch hands came to town for their weekly evening off. He usually had supper at the Lucky Spur and a whiskey or two, and he usually saw Nora at some point during the evening because the boarding house was near the saloon, and she often came through on her rounds of deliveries. He started saying good evening to her when he saw her. She started saying good evening back. This went on for 3 Saturdays, which in 1882 Texas constituted a significant social interaction. On the 4th Saturday, there was a dance. Dusty Creek held dances 4 times a year at the community hall, which was a large, mostly empty building that served as a meeting place for whatever civic need arose. The spring dance was a tradition that brought people in from the surrounding ranches and farms, and it was the kind of event where the social architecture of a small frontier community was most clearly visible. The established families of the county came dressed in their best, the ranch hands came in their cleanest shirts, and everyone danced because dancing was one of the few entertainments that was free, communal, and socially acceptable in mixed company. Cole was not much of a dancer. He knew the basic steps of the square dances that were standard in Texas in that era, the Alamand and the Promenade and the Do-Si-Do, because it was nearly impossible to have grown up in the rural South and not know them. But he had never been the kind of man who sought out dancing, and he generally spent the dance evenings on the periphery of the room with a cup of punch that was not nearly strong enough and a view of the room. He was in exactly that position when he saw Nora Ellis arrive. She was not wearing her work dress. She was wearing a dress he had not seen before, a dark green that suited her coloring in a way that made him aware that he had been noticing her coloring, which was the kind of thing that gave a man some information about himself. Her hair was still pinned up, but with more care than usual, with a few dark strands framing her face in a way that was not frivolous but was not entirely practical either. She came in with another woman he recognized as one of the schoolteacher's wives, and they found seats along the wall where the women who were not yet dancing usually gathered. Cole watched her for a while without approaching, because approaching a woman at a dance in 1882, Texas, had specific social protocols that he did not want to violate, mostly because violating them would make things awkward for her rather than for him, and he had no desire to make things awkward for Nora Ellis. He eventually worked up to walking across the room when a break in the music provided a natural opportunity. "Miss Ellis," he said, which was what he had been calling her because they had not arrived at first names yet. "Mr. Reardon," she said. She was sitting with her hands folded in her lap with the composed posture she seemed to carry everywhere, but he thought her eyes were a little brighter in the lamplight of the community hall, and she seemed, if not exactly relaxed, then at least something adjacent to it. "Are you enjoying yourself?" he asked. "I do not come to these often," she said. "But yes, I think I am. Minnie Grafton plays the fiddle much better than whoever plays at the saloon on Tuesdays." He laughed at that genuinely, and it surprised him a little because he was not particularly given to laughing. "That is not a high bar," he said. "No," she agreed, and there was something in her voice that was almost a laugh itself, suppressed but present. "Would you dance?" he asked. "If you wanted to, you do not have to." She looked at him with the assessing look she always seemed to have, the one that gave the impression she was comparing what a person said against some internal standard of accuracy. "Can you dance?" she asked. "Well enough not to injure you," he said. That suppressed laugh was closer to the surface now. "That is also not a high bar," she said. "But yes, Mr. Reardon, I would like to dance." He was, in the end, better than he had claimed to be, and she was better than she had implied she expected him to be, and they danced 3 dances before she said she needed to rest, which was what women said in 1882 when they had danced enough with a man and needed to assess the situation before they danced anymore. He brought her a cup of punch and stood beside her for a while, and they talked. He learned things about her that evening. He learned that she was 24 years old and had come to Dusty Creek 2 years ago from San Antonio, where she had been living with an aunt after her parents died of typhoid fever in 1878, when she was 20 years old. He learned that she had come to Dusty Creek because a friend from San Antonio had written to her about the boarding house position, and she had taken it because it provided room and board in addition to wages, which made the financial mathematics simpler than trying to pay for separate lodging on a working woman's salary. He learned that she read whenever she could get books, which was not as often as she would like because there was no lending library in Dusty Creek, and she had to borrow from the schoolteacher, a Mr. Avery, who was generous with his small collection. She learned things about him, too, because she asked questions with the same directness she applied to everything else. She learned that he had grown up in Georgia, the son of a farmer who had lost everything in the aftermath of the war, which was a common enough story in the 1870s South that it barely needed elaboration. He had come west at 17 with 2 older cousins who were following the cattle trails north, and he had spent 11 years learning the cattle trade from the bottom up, starting as a wrangler's helper and working his way to the skilled trail hand work he could now do. He had no family he was close to. He had not stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots, which was not something he had thought about much until recently. "Why not?" she asked. "Why have you never stayed?" It was the kind of direct question that most people in 1882 social settings would not have asked a relative stranger at a dance, because it probed at something personal. But Nora Ellis asked it the way she asked everything, not intrusively but honestly, as if she genuinely wanted to understand the answer. "Never found a reason strong enough," he said. And then, because honesty seemed to be the appropriate currency in conversations with her, he added, "Never found something that made staying seem better than moving." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I understand that. In San Antonio, I stayed because I had to. Here, I stay because I chose to. There is a difference." "Yes," he said. "There is." The fiddle started up again, and he asked if she wanted to dance once more, and she said yes, and they danced until the music ended. He rode back to the Colton spread that night under a sky full of stars that were brilliant in the way stars are when there is no competing light, and he thought about what she had said about the difference between staying because you have to and staying because you choose to. He was thinking about it still when he woke up the next morning. May came on like a promise in Dusty Creek, the hills going green and the bluebonnets coming up thick along the roadsides, and Cole settled into the rhythm of ranch work in a way that was familiar but also, he noticed, different from the way he had settled into work before. Before, work had been a temporary thing, a financial transaction between himself and whoever was paying him until he was ready to move again. Now it felt more like a foundation, which was an odd thing to feel about a job on someone else's land. He saw Nora on Saturdays and occasionally on weekday evenings if he came into town on an errand for Colton, which happened more often than strictly necessary. He was aware that he was engineering reasons to ride into Dusty Creek, and he was not particularly proud of the transparency of the engineering, but he found that the awareness did not change the behavior. Their conversations evolved. In the beginning, they had been careful and informational, the exchange of facts between two people in the process of determining whether they trusted each other. Now they were something else, something that moved more freely, that included opinions and observations and occasional humor. She told him about the books she read and what she thought of them, not the plot summary, but what the ideas in them made her think about. He told her about the country he had traveled through and the things he had seen. The great cattle drives north to Kansas in the 1870s, when 250,000 head of cattle moved up the Kishom Trail in a single season, the dust and noise of it, the beauty that was also somehow inside the chaos. She listened to him with the focused attention of someone who is genuinely interested in what another person is experiencing, not simply waiting for the conversation to circle back to themselves, and he found that being listened to in that way was something he had not realized he had been missing. He also noticed, over the course of May, that things were not entirely easy for Nora. The boarding house work was demanding and the wages were modest, and while Mrs. Hargrove was not unkind, she was also not particularly attentive to whether her employees were being treated fairly by the boarders. The mending work Nora took in supplemented her income meaningfully, but it added hours to days that were already long. One Saturday evening in late May, Cole arrived at the Lucky Spur to find that the mood in the room was different. There was a table of men in the middle of the room, who were loud in the particular way of men, who had decided that being in a saloon meant ordinary rules of behavior did not apply. 3 of the men were traveling through, salesmen or gamblers of some kind, and the 4th was a local rancher named Deke Harrow, who had a reputation in the county for being free with other people's boundaries. Cole had heard his name from other ranch hands in ways that suggested he was not someone who inspired warm feelings in those who dealt with him. Nora came in with her tray, and as she moved past Harrow's table, one of the traveling men said something Cole could not hear from across the room, but which was clearly designed to be heard by her because the table laughed at her reaction, which was the composed non-reaction she was good at. Harrow called after her in a voice that was entirely audible. "What is your price for an evening of company, sweetheart? Name it and I will beat it." The room went a little quiet in that uncomfortable way it does when something has been said that most people wish had not been said but feel insufficient reason to challenge. Nora turned and looked at Harrow with the expression Cole had come to think of as her steady gaze, the one that seemed to measure the person receiving it and find them a specific and accurate size. "I do not have a price for that," she said, "because I am not for sale. And if you call me sweetheart again, I will speak to Sheriff Bowman, however little either of us expects that to accomplish." Harrow's face did something unpleasant, and he said something else, lower this time. Cole had already risen from his seat. He was not a man who sought confrontation, but he was also not a man who found it easy to sit while something was happening that he could do something about. He walked to Harrow's table and put both hands on the edge of it and looked at Deke Harrow with the gray eyes that changed with his mood. "She said no," Cole said. "That is a complete sentence. Everything else is finished." Harrow looked up at him with the calculation of a man assessing risk. Cole was taller than Harrow and had the physical presence of someone who had spent years doing hard outdoor work, and the men at the table who were traveling through had the good sense to be silent. "This your woman?" Harrow asked. "She is a woman who said no," Cole said. "That is all the information that is required." Harrow looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked away, which was what men like him generally did when they encountered a resistance that was not emotional but simply implacable, and Cole stepped back and turned around. Nora was looking at him from near the bar. Her expression was complicated. It was not gratitude exactly, and it was not displeasure exactly, and he walked toward her because he was not sure whether she was going to say something to him or simply go back to her task. She said something to him. "You did not need to do that," she said quietly. "No," he agreed. "I was handling it." "I know," he said, "but I was closer to him than you were." Something shifted in her expression at that, something small but real. "Thank you," she said. It was the first time she had thanked him for anything, and she said it as if the words had been considered before they were released. "Do you need to finish your rounds?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I will walk with you," he said. "If you do not object." She did not object. He walked with her that night as she made her delivery rounds, and then they walked along the main street of Dusty Creek in the mild evening air, and he was aware that in 1882 Texas, a man and a woman walking together in the evening was the kind of visible social act that meant something, and he was aware that he did not mind that it meant something, and he thought she was aware of this too. "I have been in this town 2 years," she said as they walked. "And I have never had anyone who walked with me." "Not a specific person?" he asked carefully. "Not anyone," she said. "I am not from here. The women who were born here have known each other their whole lives. I am cordial with them. I am not friends with them." "That sounds lonely," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "It is what it is," she said. "I am not accustomed to things being easy, Mr. Reardon." "Cole," he said, "I think we have spent enough evenings talking that you could use my name." She looked at him sidewise. "Cole," she said, as if trying the word out. "Then my friends call me Nora." "I know," he said. "You told me on the first day." "I did," she agreed. "I suppose I was hoping you would remember." They were standing outside the boarding house now, and the lamp in the front window was making a warm square of light on the ground, and the stars were very clear, and the air smelled of cedar and night-blooming things, and Cole was aware of the particular quality of the moment, the way it was suspended between what had been and what might be. "Nora," he said, "would you go riding with me on Sunday? There is a creek about 3 miles west of the Colton spread that has cottonwood trees and what passes for shade in Texas, and I would like to show it to you if you would like to see it." She looked at him with the steady amber-brown eyes that were so good at seeing things clearly. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." He rode back to the Colton spread that night with the stars very bright above him, and something settled in his chest that felt new and right and slightly terrifying. The Sunday ride was the kind of afternoon that stays in a person's memory with unusual clarity, the specific quality of the light, the sound of the wind in the cottonwood leaves, the way the creek moved over flat limestone with a gentle noise that made conversation easier because it filled the silences comfortably. They had packed a simple lunch from Mrs. Hargrove's kitchen, bread and cheese and dried apricots that Nora had brought in a cloth bag, and they sat in the shade and ate and talked for 2 hours, and then simply sat in the comfortable way of people who have found that silence is not uncomfortable between them. She told him more about her life in San Antonio, about her father, who had been a school teacher before the typhoid, and her mother, who had been a seamstress, and how she had grown up in a household where reading was as natural as breathing, but money was always carefully managed. She told him that her parents had believed in education for their daughter, with the conviction of people who know that education is the most portable of all assets, the one thing that cannot be taken from you. And she had believed this too, and had spent her orphan years reading everything she could get her hands on, because it was the thing she could do that was still connected to them. Cole listened to all of this and understood something about her that he had been approaching from different directions for weeks. She was not simply composed, she was fortified. She had built something inside herself that could not be touched by Deke Harrow's vulgarity or Prout's credit denials, or the loneliness of being a newcomer in a closed community, because she had built it on foundations that were hers alone, the education her parents had given her, the self-reliance she had developed from necessity, the clarity of thought that came from a habit of reading and reflecting. She was not brittle. She was strong in the specific way that things are strong when they have been stressed and held. He told her things too. He told her about the loneliness of the cattle trails, which were not romantic in the way people who had not done them imagined. They were dusty and repetitive, and the days were long, and the weather was either too hot or too cold, and the work was relentless. And the thing about them that he had valued was the simplicity of the task. You knew what you needed to do and you did it, and there was a satisfaction in that which he had mistaken for a long time for contentment. Was it not? She asked. It was satisfaction, he said. That is not the same thing. She was quiet for a moment, and he thought she was turning that over the way she turned things over, thoughtfully and without hurry. No, she said finally, it is not. He looked at her in the shade of the cottonwoods with the creek making its quiet noise beside them, and said something he had not intended to say but which arrived before he could decide whether to say it. I am glad I stopped in Dusty Creek, he said. She met his eyes. So am I, she said. It was direct and simple, which was entirely how she said things. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, and she let him. And they sat like that for a long time while the afternoon went golden around them, and the cottonwood leaves whispered, and the creek went on doing what creeks do. June came in with the particular force of Texas summer, the heat arriving not gradually, but all at once like a decision, the sky going the white-blue of bleached denim at midday, and the shade of the live oaks becoming something to be sought out with genuine urgency. The work at the Colton spread intensified, because the summer months meant the movement of cattle to the better pastures, and the management of water sources, and the maintenance of infrastructure that could not be attended to when the ground was too hard or the weather too severe. Cole worked hard and was good at it, and James Colton, who was not a man given to effusive praise, told him after 6 weeks that he was the best hand he had employed in 3 years, which Cole took as the significant compliment it was. Colton also mentioned, in the matter-of-fact way he said most things, that his foreman position was open, and that Cole could have it if he wanted it, which came with a separate wage and a small house on the property that was better than the bunk in the ranch hand's quarters. Cole said he would think about it. He spent 2 days thinking about it and then said yes, and moved his things into the small house, which was 4 rooms and a porch and a view of the valley that was better in the mornings when the light came in from the east. He did not think too carefully about why the decision to stay had become easy. He thought around the edges of it and let himself know what he knew without making too large a thing of it. He and Nora had continued their Sunday rides, which had become the fixed point of his week, the thing he measured other time in relation to. They had also taken to walking together on Saturday evenings after his supper at the Lucky Spur, and these walks had grown longer and moved further from the main street of Dusty Creek out along the roads that were quieter and had more stars visible above them. He had kissed her once, on the 4th Sunday ride, standing by the creek with the cottonwoods around them. He had asked first because she was not a woman he would presume anything about, and she had said yes with the simple directness that was her way, and the kiss had been unhurried and careful, and afterward she had looked at him with eyes that were serious and also, he thought, a little wondering, as if she was adjusting some internal ledger. "I have not done much of this," she said. "Neither have I," he said. "Not in a way that mattered." She understood what he meant. He could tell by the way her expression changed, not dramatically, but with the small shift that meant something had registered. There was a problem, however. Problems have a way of not waiting for convenient times, and the problem that arrived in Dusty Creek in late June did not wait for any particular convenience. His name was Raymond Fitch, and he arrived on a Wednesday on a horse that was better than the man deserved, and he took a room at the Hargrove boarding house. Cole did not meet him directly for a day or two, but he heard about him from Lou at the Lucky Spur on the following Saturday. "Fellow named Fitch came in asking about a woman named Nora Ellis," Lou said, with the directness of a man who understood that Cole would want to know this. "Said he was a cousin of her father's from San Antonio." She did not look particularly happy to see him when he came to the boarding house. Cole filed this away. He was careful about it because it was Nora's business and he had no right to insert himself into it unless she invited him to. She told him about it that evening when they were walking, and her composure was intact, but underneath it was something that he had not seen before, something that looked like worry. "Raymond Fitch was my father's cousin," she said. "I met him twice as a child. He has come because he says my father's estate included some property that was not properly settled before my father died, and he has come to determine whether there is anything that belongs to him." "Does it?" Cole asked. "My father had nothing when he died," Nora said flatly. "He died owing his landlord 2 months of rent. Raymond Fitch knows this. He was at the funeral. There was nothing to settle." "Then why is he here?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because I have been sending small amounts of money to my aunt in San Antonio every month, and Raymond found out about it, and he believes that if I have money to send, there must be money somewhere that rightfully belongs to the estate." She paused. "There is not. The money I send to my aunt is from my own wages. I save it carefully, and I send what I can because she is old and her eyesight is failing and she cannot work as she once did." Raymond sees this as evidence of a hidden source of funds. "What does he actually want?" Cole asked. "I think he wants me to stop sending the money," she said, "or to send it to him instead. I'm not certain which." She said this with a flatness that told him she had already assessed both possibilities and found them equally unacceptable. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "Continue sending money to my aunt," she said, "and avoid Raymond Fitch as much as the size of this town allows." Cole thought about this. "If he becomes a problem," he said carefully, "I want you to tell me." She looked at him. "I appreciate that," she said, "but this is my difficulty to manage." "I know," he said. "I'm not trying to take it from you. I am saying that if you need help, I am here." She was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice that was slightly softer than usual, she said, "I know you are, Cole, I know." Raymond Fitch did become a problem. Not immediately and not dramatically, because he was the kind of man who worked at the edges of things, who applied pressure gradually rather than openly, which was in some ways more exhausting to resist than an open confrontation. He began appearing wherever Nora was, not threatening, simply present, making pointed comments about the family, invoking her father's name in ways designed to generate obligation. He also began visiting Mrs. Hargrove and expressing concern about his cousin's well-being and her circumstances, framing himself as a concerned family member in a way that made Nora's composed refusals of his attentions look like ingratitude rather than the reasonable self-protection they were. Cole watched this happening over the course of 2 weeks and felt a steady, controlled anger about it that he did not act on because Nora had not asked him to act on it, and he respected her agency enough to wait until she did. She came to find him at the Colton spread on a Thursday, which was unusual because she generally did not come out to the ranch. He was mending fence on the east pasture when he saw her riding toward him on the rented horse from the livery, and he could tell from the way she was riding that something had happened. She pulled up near where he was working and dismounted, and told him what had happened with the efficiency of someone who needs to communicate information clearly and does not have time for preamble. Fitch had spoken to Sheriff Bowman, she said. He had told Bowman that he had evidence that Nora had been sending money out of an estate that included funds belonging to the family, and that he was considering a legal action. Bowman, who was not a clever man and who had been given a version of events that sounded plausible, had told Nora that she might want to consult with a lawyer. "There is no lawyer in Dusty Creek," Nora said. Her voice was level, but he could see the cost of the level, the control it was taking. "No," he agreed, "there is not. The nearest one is in Mason, which is 30 miles from here." Cole set down his fence pliers. "Is there any paperwork that would establish that the estate was settled? Death records, creditor payments, anything like that?" "In San Antonio," she said, "with the county clerk's office, which is also not here." He thought about it. "If we wrote to the county clerk in San Antonio and requested copies of the relevant records, how long would it take?" 2 weeks at minimum, 3 more likely with the mail as it is. He looked at her. She was holding herself very straight, the way she always did, but there was something in her eyes that he had not seen there before. It was not quite fear. It was the specific exhaustion of someone who has been managing everything alone for a very long time and has just encountered something that might be beyond what they can manage alone. "Will you let me help you?" he said. "Not manage it for you, help you." She looked at him for a long moment. "How?" she asked. "I will write the letter to the San Antonio county clerk," he said. "I will pay for it to go by express mail, which is faster. And I will talk to James Colton, who knows most of the landowners and business people in this part of Texas, and ask if he knows a lawyer in Mason who could be reached quickly." "I cannot afford a lawyer," she said. "We will manage that when we know what we need," he said. The word "we" landed between them. She heard it. He saw her hear it. "Cole," she said, and her voice was careful and honest, "I do not want to be someone who needs rescuing." "You are not being rescued," he said. "You are being helped by someone who wants to help you. That is a different thing." She was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass around them, and the horses stood patiently, and somewhere in the distance, one of the Colton cattle was complaining about something. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He wrote the letter that evening and paid for the express postal service the next morning in Dusty Creek, and he spoke to Colton, who did know a lawyer in Mason named Calhoun, and who wrote a note of introduction that Cole sent along with the San Antonio letter. In the 2 weeks that they were waiting for the records to arrive, something else happened. It happened on a Thursday evening when Cole came into Dusty Creek for supplies and saw Fitch coming out of the boarding house with the particular satisfied expression of a man who believes he has accomplished something. Cole did not speak to him. He went to the boarding house and knocked on the side door that Nora had told him was the entrance to her room. She answered, and he could tell by her face that she was upset, which for Nora meant a very slight tightening around her eyes and a compression of her mouth that in another person would have been tears. "He showed Mrs. Hargrove," she said, "a letter. He claims it is from a banker in San Antonio who will testify that there are funds from my father's estate that were not properly distributed." She paused. "There are no such funds. The letter is either forged or wildly misrepresenting something that is entirely innocent." "What is Mrs. Hargrove going to do?" Cole asked. "She said she cannot have the boarding house involved in a legal matter," Nora said. "She has given me until the end of the month to resolve the situation, or she will have to reconsider my position." Cole stood in the doorway and looked at her and felt that steady, controlled anger move through him like a current. "He is trying to take your livelihood," he said. "Yes," she said, "he is." She said it matter-of-factly, as if she had already processed the emotional dimension of it and filed it somewhere, and was now operating on the practical level where she was most effective. "Nora," he said, "I need to tell you something." She looked at him. "I am not a man who is good with words the way some men are," he said. "I have spent most of my life outdoors doing work that does not require a great many words. So I am going to say this plainly, and I am asking you to hear it plainly, not to read anything into it that is not there." She waited, which was something she was good at. "I care about you," he said. "More than I have cared about anyone in a long time. I think you know that. I also think you know that it is not simply about solving your problems, because you are more than capable of solving your own problems, and you have been doing it since you were 16 years old." He paused. "But I want to be someone you rely on, not because you have to, but because you choose to. I want to be a reason that Dusty Creek is where you stay." The amber-brown eyes were looking at him very directly. "Cole," she said. "I am not finished," he said. "I also want you to know that whatever happens with Fitch, whether the records come or they do not, whether Mrs. Hargrove keeps your position or she does not, I am not going anywhere. I took a job here, I took a house here. Those were not accidental decisions." She was very still for a moment. Then she said, "I know they were not accidental decisions." "Do you?" he asked. "Yes," she said. And then, in the honest, direct way she said important things, "I made some decisions that were not accidental either." He reached out and took her hand, and she held his back, and they stood in the doorway of the boarding house while the evening settled around Dusty Creek. "Let me deal with Fitch," he said. "Not for you, with you, alongside you." She was quiet for a moment, then she nodded. "Together," she said. The records arrived in 12 days, faster than they had hoped because the San Antonio County clerk was apparently an efficient man. The records were clear and complete. Henry Ellis, Nora's father, had died in September of 1878 with debts totaling more than he owned in assets. The estate had been formally settled through the probate process in 1879, with all creditors receiving partial payments and the remainder of the debt forgiven by operation of law. There were no funds from the estate. There was nothing to distribute. Raymond Fitch had not been named in the probate proceedings in any capacity. Cole also heard back from the lawyer Calhoun in Mason, who had reviewed the situation based on Colton's letter and Cole's follow-up, and who wrote back that what Fitch was doing appeared to constitute harassment and potentially fraud if his letter to Mrs. Hargrove had misrepresented the financial situation, and that a formal letter from Calhoun's office would likely be sufficient to cause a man like Fitch to reconsider his position. They went to see Sheriff Bowman together, Cole and Nora, with the records from San Antonio and Calhoun's letter. Bowman read both documents with the slow care of a man who was not accustomed to reading legal documents and wanted to be sure he understood them, and then he said that he would have a word with Raymond Fitch. The word Bowman had with Fitch was apparently sufficient, because Fitch left Dusty Creek 3 days later on the same horse he had arrived on, and they did not see him again. The morning after Fitch left, Cole was at the livery seeing to Red when Nora appeared at the stable entrance with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "For you," she said, and held it out. He unwrapped it. Inside was a book, a slim volume of poetry by Walt Whitman that had been published in a new edition in 1881. On the inside front cover, she had written in her neat, precise handwriting, "For a man who stayed." He stood in the livery holding the book and could not speak for a moment, which was unusual for him even given that he was not a man of many words. "You mentioned once that you had read nothing but cattle ledgers for years," she said. "I thought it was time to remedy that." "Where did you get this?" he asked. "There was no bookstore in Dusty Creek." "I wrote to a bookseller in San Antonio 6 weeks ago," she said, "when I thought you might be staying. 6 weeks ago. Before the Sunday rides had started, before the evening walks, before the Fitch situation, before almost everything. She had thought he might be staying, and she had written to a bookstore." "Nora," he said. "You do not have to say anything," she said. "I want to," he said. He put the book carefully in his vest pocket and took both her hands in his. "I have spent 11 years moving from place to place and thinking that the moving was freedom. I understand now that it was the opposite of freedom. This being here, Knowing where I am going to be tomorrow, knowing that you are here, this is what freedom actually feels like." Her eyes were very bright. Not tearful, because she was Nora and tears required a particular catastrophe to arrive uninvited, but bright with something that was very close to them. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "I would like to ask Mrs. Hargrove's permission to call on you formally, which is how these things are supposed to be done in Texas in 1882, and I would like to take you to the dance next month and the one after that. And I would like to sit with you at the church social if you go to church socials, and I would like to show you every part of this county that is worth seeing." "That is a great many things," she said. "It is," he agreed. "I have a lot of time to make up for." She squeezed his hands. "Ask Mrs. Hargrove," she said. "She will say yes. I have already told her that you are a person of good character." "Have you?" he said. "I told you," she said. "I investigate people I am interested in. I spoke to James Colton. I spoke to Lou. I spoke to Mrs. Callahan. You have an excellent reputation with everyone who has worked with you or known you, and the only person in this town who has said anything negative about you is Deke Harrow, who is not a reliable source." He laughed. It was the full, open kind of laugh that he did not do often and which came from somewhere genuine. "You investigated me," he said. "Thoroughly," she confirmed, and there was that suppressed laugh in her voice again, closer to the surface than ever. He leaned forward and kissed her, right there in the entrance to the livery in the morning sunlight, which was entirely visible to anyone who might be passing on the main street of Dusty Creek, and he found that he did not mind at all. The summer of 1882 in Dusty Creek was the particular kind of summer that Cole would later think of as the turning point, the before and after in the geography of his life. He worked hard at the Colton spread and was good at the foreman work, which required not just physical skill but judgment and the management of other men, and he found he had a better aptitude for the management of people than he had suspected. Colton relied on him increasingly, and the ranch prospered in the modest, steady way of well-run operations. He called on Nora with the proper formality of the era, visiting on Wednesday and Saturday evenings with Mrs. Hargrove's blessing, which had been given quickly because Mrs. Hargrove, for all her caution about legal matters, was a woman who liked seeing young people make sensible decisions. She and Nora walked and talked and read aloud to each other from his Whitman, and from the other books she borrowed from Mr. Avery, and they discovered that their tastes overlapped in interesting ways and diverged in others, and both the overlaps and the divergences were interesting. He also learned, over the course of that summer, more of the texture of her daily life and the injustices that were woven into it in ways that she accepted with composure, but that he found increasingly difficult to observe without reaction. She was paid less than the male employees of similar rank in comparable establishments, which was simply the reality of 1882 Texas and of the country at large, where women's wages were understood to be supplementary rather than primary income regardless of the facts of any particular woman's situation. The mending work she did was essential to her financial stability, but the women who brought her work paid her as little as possible because they understood that her options were limited. Mrs. Hargrove was not cruel, but she was also not generous, and Nora's room was the smallest in the boarding house, and her meals were taken separately from the boarders because that was the staff's understood position. Cole did not pretend these things were not happening or make speeches about them, because speeches about injustice in 1882 Texas were not particularly effective, and Nora had not asked for speeches. He simply listened when she talked about these things, and he thought about them, and he let his thinking move in the direction it was already moving anyway. In September, on a Sunday afternoon at the creek with the cottonwoods beginning to go yellow at the edges, he asked her to marry him. He had thought about how to say it and decided that with Nora, the plain and honest approach was always the right one. "I want to spend my life with you," he said. "I want to build something with you, not just the fence lines and the cattle counts and the roof that does not leak, but the actual life inside all of that. I have the house on the Colton spread, which is not much now but could be more with time and work. I have a good position and a fair wage and the prospect of continuing both. But none of that matters in the way I want it to matter without you in it." He paused. "I am asking you to marry me, Nora. Not because you need a solution or a protector or any of the things that men are supposed to provide in the year 1882, but because I love you and I think you love me, and I would like us to choose each other officially, and then spend the rest of our lives being glad we did." She was looking at him with the full intensity of the amber-brown eyes that he had come to know better than his own reflection. "Yes," she said. "Cole, yes." He had the ring. He had saved for 2 months and ridden to Mason to get it from a jeweler there, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone that he had thought suited her better than the flashier settings he had been shown, because she was not a flashy person and he wanted something that fit who she actually was. He put it on her finger and she looked at it for a long moment and then looked at him. "Turquoise," she said. "It is the color of the Texas sky in October," he said, "which is the best color the sky gets." She put both hands on either side of his face and kissed him, and the cottonwoods rustled their yellow approval, and the creek went on with its cheerful commentary, and the late September light was the best light of the year. They were married in November of 1882, on a Saturday in the second week of the month, at the small Methodist church in Dusty Creek. It was not a large wedding because neither of them had large families to invite, and they both preferred simplicity to ceremony. Nora's aunt from San Antonio came, making the journey by train to San Antonio, and then by stage to Mason, and then by whatever conveyance was available from Mason to Dusty Creek, arriving 2 days before the wedding with the determination of a woman who intended to be present at her niece's marriage no matter what the geography required. Her name was Helen, and she was a small woman in her late 60s with failing eyesight and a sharp mind, and Cole liked her immediately because she looked at him with the same assessing thoroughness as Nora, and said within an hour of meeting him that she could see why Nora had chosen him, and that she approved. James Colton stood up for Cole, and Minnie Grafton, who played the fiddle better than the Tuesday man, played something gentle and hymn-like as Nora walked down the short aisle of the church. Lou the barkeep came, and Mrs. Callahan, and even Mrs. Hargrove, who left a note for her boarders saying she would be gone for 2 hours for a wedding, and that lunch was on the sideboard. Nora wore a cream-colored dress that she had made herself in the evenings over the preceding 6 weeks, quietly and without mentioning it, until Cole had come to the church and seen her. It was simply cut but beautifully made, with careful stitching that spoke to the years of mending work that had made her hands precise and her eye for detail exacting. She carried a small bunch of late-season wildflowers that Minnie Grafton had helped her gather that morning from the hillsides outside of town. She was the most beautiful thing Cole had ever seen. The ceremony was performed by the Methodist minister, a Reverend Morris, who had a good voice and a practical approach to religion that suited the frontier. When the vows were said and the ring was given, and Reverend Morris said the words that made them husband and wife, Cole looked at Nora and thought about the day he had dropped a few coins on a barrel top outside a general store, and she had returned them with a precision and a dignity that had made him understand in the space of 60 seconds that she was not like anyone he had ever known. He thought about that moment often after. It was the thing that had started everything, her returning the money, that clear statement of self-sufficiency and pride, and the understanding that gifts from strangers come with costs that are not always declared up front. It was the first thing about her that he had truly seen, and in retrospect it contained everything that was most important about who she was. The reception was held at the Lucky Spur, which Lou had closed for regular business and opened for the wedding party, and Minnie Grafton played the fiddle properly, and everyone danced, and Lou produced a punch that was somewhat stronger than the community hall variety, and Mrs. Callahan brought 3 apple pies that vanished with considerable speed. Aunt Helen sat in a chair near the wall and watched the dancing with the pleased expression of a woman who has been worrying about her niece and has now been given reason to stop. Cole danced with Nora for most of the evening because she was his wife now, and he intended to make the most of every opportunity that status afforded him. And she was a better dancer than he was when she was not holding herself back, which she was not, because this was her wedding and she was happy, and he could see the happiness in her clearly, the loosening of the careful composure into something more open and radiant. Late in the evening, when the dancing had slowed and people were sitting in comfortable groups, Aunt Helen called Cole to her chair and took his hand and said, in the direct way the Ellis women apparently had in their blood, "Take good care of her. She has been taking care of herself for too long. I will take care of her," he said, "and she will take care of me. That is how we have decided to do it." Helen looked at him for a moment and then patted his hand with the satisfied air of someone who has received exactly the answer they were looking for. Nora moved into the house on the Colton spread, and they began the work of making it a home together. It was different from managing a boarding house room. There was more space and more latitude and more of the accumulated texture of a shared life to navigate. The question of who did what and where things went and how mornings worked and what evenings looked like. They negotiated this without serious conflict because they were both people who said what they meant and meant what they said, and because the particular character that had made them interesting to each other was also useful for the practical business of being married. Nora kept the mending work, not because the financial need was as acute now that she had a husband's wage in the household account, but because it was her own income and she intended to maintain the habit of it. Cole did not argue with this because he understood who she was. She also took on the management of the ranch household accounts, which she was better at than he was, with a precision that quickly identified several places where money had been leaking out unnecessarily. The house grew into itself over the winter of 1882 and into 1883. Cole added a bookshelf, built from lumber he brought from Mason, because her books had nowhere to live and were stacked on every flat surface in a way that delighted him but he thought could be better organized. She put curtains at the windows that she made from fabric she had chosen at Prute's store. Not fussy curtains, but good practical ones that kept the light out in the early morning when she wanted to sleep longer and the cold out in the winter evenings. He read the Whitman poems she had given him, working through them slowly in the evenings by lamplight while she read or sewed, and he found that some of them hit him squarely in the chest with the specific force of something true. He read one to her aloud one evening, the part about containing multitudes, and she looked up from her mending and said that she thought that was accurate, that people were more complicated than the boxes other people tried to put them in, and they had a conversation about it that went on until the lamp oil was running low. The spring of 1883 came. The bluebonnets came back along the roadsides, and the cedar was bright green, and the creek ran clear and strong from the winter rains. Cole was walking the east fence line with one of the ranch hands, a young man named Robert who was 17 and learning the trade, when Robert said something that stuck with him. "Mr. Reardon," Robert said, in the tentative way of a young person asking something they think might be out of bounds. "How did you know when you wanted to stay somewhere? When it was the right place?" Cole thought about this as they walked. The morning was fine and the grass was green, and from where they were he could see the roof of his house in the distance. "You do not decide to stay in a place," he said finally. "You decide to stay in the life that is in that place. The place is just where the life happens to be." Robert thought about this and nodded with the serious consideration of a 17-year-old who is working out who he is going to be. Cole thought about it some more himself, walking back to the house in the late afternoon, and found it was true, and he was glad it was true. Nora was on the porch when he came up from the field, sitting in the chair she had moved outside because the afternoon was too fine to be indoors, and she had a book on her lap but she was not reading it. She was looking at the valley with the particular expression she had when she was thinking something through, the quiet, focused look that he had come to know as well as any of her expressions. "What are you thinking?" he asked, coming up the porch steps and sitting in the other chair. She looked at him. Her expression shifted to something different, something with a specific quality of significance. "I am thinking," she said slowly, "that the house is going to need to become somewhat different over the next several months." He looked at her. He waited because he was a man who had learned to wait with her, to let the full shape of what she was saying arrive. "We are going to need a cradle," she said, "and other things, but starting with a cradle." The late afternoon light was the color of honey, and the valley was green, and his wife was looking at him with the amber-brown eyes he knew better than he knew his own, and she was telling him that they were going to have a child. He did not have words for a moment. When they came, they were not eloquent, but they were real. "A cradle," he said. "Yes," she said. He took her hand. He held it. He thought about the course of things, the long, random chain of events that had pointed him toward Dusty Creek on a spring afternoon in 1882, the cattle deal that had gone wrong in Abilene, the south road he had taken instead of north, the corner table at the Lucky Spur, the silver dollar on the barrel top, and this woman who had given it back with a dignity that had rearranged something fundamental in how he understood the world. "I will build the cradle," he said, "and whatever else we need. I will build it all." She squeezed his hand. "I know you will," she said, "and I will tell you exactly how I want it made." He laughed and she smiled, and the evening came on warm and easy over the Texas hill country. He wrote to his two cousins who were somewhere up in Colorado doing mining work, because they were the closest thing to family he had, and told them about the marriage and the news of the coming child. He had not been in close touch with them for several years, and the writing of the letter made him aware of the passage of time and the way lives diverge, and then sometimes, if you are lucky, come back into contact. One of the cousins, a man named Pete, wrote back within a month and said that he and his wife were thinking of coming south because the mining was playing out, and he had heard there was good ranching country in Texas. Cole wrote back that he knew a county that might suit them and spoke to Colton, who had been considering expanding his operation, and who said that if Pete Reardon was half as reliable as Cole, he would be glad to have him. Pete and his wife Della arrived in August of 1883, when Nora was large with the child, and the summer heat was at its full Texas intensity. Della was a cheerful, energetic woman from Ohio who had been following Pete through various Western adventures for 5 years, and who took to Nora with the directness of someone who recognized a kindred spirit. The two women became friends with a speed that surprised both of their husbands, who had expected the friendship to develop more slowly. The child was born in September of 1883, on a warm, clear night that smelled of cedar, and he was a boy. They named him Henry, after Nora's father, and Cole held him in the first morning light and thought about the schoolteacher from San Antonio, who had believed so strongly in education that he had passed that belief into his daughter like an inheritance, and who had not lived to see what his daughter had made of herself, but who was present in her in every conversation and every book and every precise and honest word she spoke. Henry was a good baby in the way that some babies are, solid and observant, looking at the world with large, dark eyes that had the same quality of careful attention as his mother's. Cole was somewhat undone by him, in the private interior way that men of his era and type generally experienced their first child, a vast and unexpected love that arrived without warning, and for which he had no adequate preparation. Nora took to motherhood with the same competence she brought to everything, but also with a warmth that Cole had always known was in her, but that expanded now into something more openly visible. She sang to Henry quiet songs she half remembered from her own childhood, and she talked to him as if he understood everything she was saying, which she explained was because she intended him to understand everything eventually, and there was no point starting him off with simpler language than necessary. Aunt Helen came to visit when Henry was 2 months old and sat in the rocking chair that Cole had added to the porch, and held the baby with the careful competence of a woman who had held many children in her long life, and cried a little, which was the first time Nora had seen her cry since her father's funeral. The autumn of 1883 settled into the winter of 1883, and then the winter gave way to the spring of 1884, and the years began to move in the way that years move when a life has found its shape, and the shape is good. Cole had been promoted in the spring of 1884 to a partnership agreement with James Colton, who was getting older and had no sons of his own, and had come, over the course of their 2 years of working together, to think of Cole in the way that older men sometimes think of the younger men they have trained, not exactly as a son, but as something close to it. The partnership was a formal arrangement, negotiated carefully with the help of Calhoun and Mason, and it gave Cole a stake in the Colton spread that would, upon Colton's death, become a full ownership with appropriate provisions for Colton's remaining family. It was the kind of thing that would have seemed impossible to the 17-year-old from Georgia who had come west with 2 cousins and nothing else, and Cole thought about that occasionally, not with self-congratulation, but with a genuine wonder at how far a life could travel if it kept moving in an honest direction. Nora began teaching. It was not planned exactly. Mr. Avery, the schoolteacher, had a class of 15 children in a schoolhouse that needed another teacher because Dusty Creek was growing in the particular way of Texas hill country towns in the 1880s, slowly but steadily, as more families arrived and took up land. Mr. Avery knew Nora from her borrowing of his books and from various community conversations, and he knew that she was educated beyond the average for the time and place, and he asked her if she would consider assisting with the younger children 3 days a week. She said yes before she had finished considering it, which was unusual for her, and told Cole that evening that she had said yes before she had thought about it, and that she thought this probably meant something. "It means it is what you have been waiting to do," he said. "Without knowing you were waiting." She thought about this. "My father was a teacher," she said. "Yes," he said, "I know." She looked at him with the full weight of the amber-brown eyes. "You knew before I did," she said. "I suspected," he said diplomatically. She threw a pillow at him, which was not something she would have done 2 years ago, and which he found enormously charming. She taught with the same precision and engagement she brought to books and conversation, and the children, who ranged in age from 6 to 10 in her portion of the class, responded to her the way children respond to adults who respect them, which is to say enthusiastically, and with the particular devotion that can be one of the most rewarding things a human being can experience. Henry was 18 months old by the time her teaching had settled into a full routine, and Cole's mother-in-law, the former Aunt Helen, had moved from San Antonio to Dusty Creek, because Nora had asked her to, and because Helen was aging in ways that made living alone in a city less advisable than it had been. She had a room in the boarding house, now under new management since Mrs. Hargrove had retired, and she spent her days with a comfortable mix of sitting on the porch of Cole and Nora's house, watching Henry discover the world, and attending the various social functions of Dusty Creek, which she had taken to with the enthusiastic social engagement of a woman who had been somewhat lonely in San Antonio, and was not in the least bit lonely now. Her eyesight had continued to decline, as it had been declining since before Nora had come to Dusty Creek. By the spring of 1885, she could no longer read, which was a loss she felt keenly, and Nora had begun reading to her in the evenings when Henry was asleep and the work of the day was done. Cole sometimes sat and listened to these reading sessions, and he thought there was something beautiful about it, the line of inheritance going from a schoolteacher who had believed in books to a daughter who had used them to build herself, and was now reading them aloud to the old woman who had kept her after the schoolteacher died. The second child arrived in the summer of 1885. A girl this time, born on a July morning with the Texas heat already impressive before 8 o'clock, born with a voice that made clear from the first moment that she had things to say and intended to say them. They named her Clara after Cole's mother, who had died when he was 12, and who he remembered as a woman of great warmth and very little nonsense, which seemed appropriate. Clara was different from Henry from the beginning, louder and more immediate, with her father's gray eyes and her mother's directness, and a combination of the two that was occasionally overwhelming. Henry, who was 2, regarded her with the serious scientific attention of a small person encountering a new phenomenon, and within a few months had adopted a protective stance toward her that Cole found both amusing and moving. Pete and Della were well established by now, Pete working the expanded Colton operation, and Della teaching alongside Nora on the days when Nora was at the ranch with the children. They had their own child by then as well, a boy named Jack who was between Henry and Clara in age, and who played with Henry with the uncomplicated happiness of children who have grown up beside each other. Dusty Creek grew. By 1886, it had a proper bank, which was a stone building with an impressive door that made people feel more confident about their deposits, and a second general store that provided useful competition for Prout, who had been made somewhat more reasonable by the prospect of losing business. There was a doctor now, Dr. Samuel Vance, who had come from Georgia and set up a proper practice, and whose arrival had changed the entire character of healthcare in the county. Cole expanded the Colton operation in 1886, adding a section of land to the north that increased the grazing capacity significantly. James Colton, now in his early 60s and moving more slowly than he had when Cole first arrived, was glad to have the younger man making these decisions while he sat on the porch of the main house and watched the operation he had built running itself competently. It was Colton who said something to Cole one evening in late 1886 that Cole would always remember. They were sitting on the porch of the main house after supper, looking out at the land in the fading light, and Colton said, "You know what makes a ranch run, Cole? Not the cattle, not the fences, not the water, the people. The right people in the right place with the right reasons for being there." Cole thought about Nora returning $3.50 to him in a livery stable doorway. "Yes," he said, "I do know." The years moved. 1887 brought a drought that was hard on the county, but the Colton operation had water management in place that they had put in during the wet years, and they came through it better than many. 1888 brought good rains and good prices for cattle and a general sense of prosperity in the hill country that lifted everyone. Henry started school in 1888 in Nora's classroom, which created an interesting domestic dynamic that they had both anticipated, and which played out more or less as they had expected, with Henry being careful to treat his mother's classroom with exactly the seriousness he treated everything else, and Nora being careful to treat Henry with exactly the fairness she extended to every child, which was considerable. Clara at 3 was a force of nature in a small body, with opinions about everything and the vocabulary to express them, and the combination of her father's physical courage and her mother's intellectual precision was producing a person who was going to require a great deal of energy from everyone around her for the foreseeable future, which both her parents found more delightful than exhausting, though they did not always say this at bedtime. Aunt Helen died in the spring of 1889, quietly and without drama, in her room at the boarding house, with Nora beside her. She had been declining slowly but without particular suffering for the previous year, and the end came on a morning in April when Dusty Creek was full of bluebonnets, and the air smelled of cedar, and the world was bright and clear. Nora sat with her until it was over and then came home to Cole, and he held her for a long time without speaking because that was what was needed. They buried Helen in the Dusty Creek Cemetery beside 2 of the founding families of the town, which was not where Cole had expected the old woman to end up, but which seemed right in its way, because she had come to Dusty Creek and made herself a part of it in the way that the best kind of people do, by simply being present and good and engaged with whatever was happening around them. Cole planted a cedar tree on her grave because she had come to love the smell of them in her time in the hill country, having grown up in San Antonio, where the cedars were everywhere and which she associated with her happiest years. The third child came in 1890, a boy they named James after Colton, who had died in the winter of 1889 and whose passing had been genuine grief for Cole, the loss of a man who had believed in him when there was no particular reason to. James Colton had left the ranch to Cole formally in the end, as the partnership agreement had stipulated, with appropriate provisions for Colton's sister in San Antonio and a small bequest to the Dusty Creek Methodist Church. Cole had taken the full ownership of the spread with the same seriousness with which he had taken everything Colton had trusted him with, which was to say completely. Little James, from the first, had the easygoing temperament that made people underestimate what was happening behind it, because behind the easygoing surface was a mind that was quietly noting everything. He was his mother's son in that particular way, the observer who misses nothing. Nora had become the lead teacher at the Dusty Creek School by 1890, with Mr. Avery having reached retirement age and departing with a testimonial dinner that the whole town attended, and at which Nora spoke with the eloquence that came naturally to her and reduced Mr. Avery to happy tears. She had 2 teaching assistants now, and a classroom of 31 children who ranged in age from 6 to 14, because some of the older children from the ranch families only recently had access to schooling. She was also in correspondence with several educational journals in the East, having written an article about teaching literacy in rural frontier communities that had been published in a Boston Education Quarterly in 1889, and had generated enough response that she had written 2 more. Cole had read all 3 articles and found them clear and precise and full of ideas that were genuinely original, and he had told her so, and she had said she was simply writing what she knew from experience, which was what he had said was the most useful writing anyone could do. He thought about where he had been 11 years earlier, riding south from Abilene with $43 and a horse and no particular direction. He thought about the road and the town and the saloon, and the woman who had walked through the front door of the Lucky Spur with a tray, and removed a man's hand from her arm with dignity and composure. He thought about $3.50 on a barrel top, and a woman returning it to him in a livery doorway. He thought sometimes about the specific quality of the moment when she had put those coins in his hand, the briefness of the contact, the warmth of her fingers, the absolute clarity of what she was communicating, which was that she was not a woman who could be made to feel obligated by a random act of generosity from a stranger, because she understood too clearly what such obligations could cost. In the autumn of 1893, on a Sunday when the cottonwoods along their creek were the brilliant yellow of a color that has no better name than itself, Cole walked out to the creek with Nora, while the 3 children stayed at the house with Pete and Della, who had become so thoroughly integrated into the life of the ranch and the town that imagining Dusty Creek without them was impossible. He and Nora sat in the shade of the cottonwoods where they had sat for the first time in 1882, 11 years earlier, when he had told her he was glad he had stopped in Dusty Creek, and she had said she was glad too, with the simple honesty that was entirely hers. The creek was the same. The trees were older and taller, and the shade they made was better. Everything else had changed. "Do you remember the first time we sat here?" he asked. "Yes," she said. She was leaning against him, which was something she had come to in the years of their marriage gradually and now did without thinking, the ease of long partnership. "You told me about your parents," he said. "Your father the teacher." "Yes." "And I told you about the cattle trails." "Yes." She looked at the creek. "You said the moving was not freedom. That you had mistaken it for freedom." "You remembered that," he said. "I remember most of what you have ever told me," she said. "I find you interesting." He turned his head and looked at her. In the cottonwood light she was unchanged in the way that the important things about a person are unchanged. The quality of the attention in her eyes, the composure that was not rigidity but strength, the honesty that had been the first thing he had understood about her and remained the truest thing he knew about her. "I love you," he said. She looked at him with the amber-brown eyes that were exactly as clear and direct as they had always been. "I love you," she said, "enormously. And I intend to continue doing so for a very long time." He put his arm around her and she settled against him, and the creek went on, and the cottonwoods moved in the light wind, and the yellow leaves came down one at a time in the warm October air. They sat there for a long time, long enough for the angle of the light to shift, and the shadows to lengthen, and the afternoon to begin its slow turn toward evening. And there was nothing in the silence between them that was not comfortable and full and right. When they walked back to the house, they could hear the children before they could see them, the specific escalating noise of 3 children and 2 adults playing some kind of game in the yard, and Cole recognized Henry's measured voice and Clara's louder, and more immediate one and little James's cheerful contribution to whatever was happening, and Della's laugh and Pete's exaggerated complaint about whatever the children were doing to him. Nora stopped walking for a moment when they could see the house and the porch and the yard full of people, and she stood there with the late afternoon light on her and looked at it. He looked at her looking at it. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I am thinking about that morning outside Prute's store, when I did not ask you for help and you helped me anyway, and then you had the good sense to give me back the money I did not ask for and had not asked for and would have figured out on my own." "I know you would have," he said. "I know you know," she said. "That was the first thing I understood about you. That you knew that and helped anyway, not because you thought I needed saving, but because you had the coins and it seemed faster." She paused. "It was a very honest reason. I respected it." "That is not exactly a thunderstruck declaration of love," he said. She turned to look at him, and there was that suppressed laugh, older now and more free than it had been, closer to the surface and requiring less suppression. "No," she agreed, "but I was not in love with you that morning. I was simply intrigued by the fact that you seemed to understand something that most men in 1882 Texas did not understand." "What was that?" he asked. "That I was capable," she said simply, "and that capability was worth respecting." He took her hand. "It took me about 4 days to fall in love with you," he said. "Which is not particularly slow, but which was slower than the moment in the livery when I saw you ride up to find me, and I thought that whatever is happening here, I want it to keep happening." She looked at him for a moment with the full steady attention that had always made him feel more seen than he had expected to be. "The money," she said. "Those $3.50 were the best investment I ever made. I gave them back to you and got everything worth having." He laughed. She laughed too, the full version, which was a thing he had worked to earn, and which he considered among his greatest achievements. They walked into the yard where the children ran to them, and Pete made some complaint about Henry's strategy in whatever game they had been playing, and Della declared that supper was almost ready, and the noise and warmth of it rose up around them like something physical, like the smell of cedar and the creek water and the bluebonnets in the spring. Inside the house the lamps were already lit, and the supper was on the stove, and the books were on the shelf that Cole had built, and Nora's curtains were at the windows. And in the bedroom, the 3 children's beds were exactly where they had been for years and would be for years more, and everything that mattered was exactly where it was supposed to be. Cole sat at the table that evening with his wife beside him and his children around him, and his cousin across from him and his cousin's wife, bringing food to the table, and outside the window the Texas night was deep and full of stars, the same stars that had been above him on a dozen cattle trails and 100 roadside camps, and 1,000 nights when he had been moving through the world without knowing what he was moving toward, and he understood that he had arrived. Not at a destination, the way a trail hand arrives at the end of a drive, but at the kind of place that becomes more fully itself the longer you inhabit it, the kind of place that has your name in it before you know it, the kind of life that has been waiting for you to stop moving long enough to find it. He poured coffee from the pot and passed it to Nora, and she took it with the same small, decisive gesture she brought to everything, and he thought about a woman standing in a livery doorway with coins in her outstretched hand. And he thought about all the roads and decisions and lucky accidents and hard-won choices that had led from that doorway to this table. And he thought that the entirety of it, every single bit of it, had been exactly worth whatever it had cost. The autumn deepened and the cottonwoods gave their last yellow, and the cedar stayed green and the coltan spread lay across the valley in the late 1893 Texas evening like something that had always been there and always would be. And inside the house the light was warm and the voices were familiar, and the life that two people had chosen, from the basis of a returned silver dollar and an honest conversation in a livery stable, went on.